item number 8. We have another report. Is this the 5th to us, Mr. Wilson? 7th. As you know, the Delta Water Master was a position created in the 2009 legislation within the State Water Resources Control Board. Mr. Damrell, I believe this is the first time you've heard from Mr. Wilson, longtime chief legal advisor to the Water Board itself, now in a slightly different and in some ways independent role, which is quite interesting, and this is his 7th report to the Council on activities. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Eisenberg, members of the board. Excuse me?
Just by way of introducing the item, Mr. Wilson is going to talk about, part of the requirement is that he present reports to the State Water Board and the Delta Stewardship Council. And he recently authored a report on gates and barriers in the Delta, and he's going to discuss that. But in addition, there was recently a letter from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation.
Which is part of the packet.
Yeah, which is in the packet. And from DWR asking about the unprecedented dry conditions in the Sacramento Valley and actions necessary to protect the cold water pool. And in fact, that was the subject of a Sacramento Bee article this morning. And Mr. Wilson responded on behalf of the Water Board. And so he's going to discuss that as well as the report today.
Okay, great. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mark. And as Mark said, I'll be talking about these two topics. But before beginning, I wanted to introduce a new staff member that joined our small office of the Delta Water Master. Her name is Christine Rico. And Christine, in addition to having an environmental science degree, is a third-generation farmer involved in farming operations in Yolo County, north of Woodland. So I've already relied heavily on her to get a farming perspective of some of the issues that we've been involved in. So it's a great addition to the staff.
Good. Well, welcome on board, and we're glad to see you.
So if we can cue up my PowerPoint, I'll begin the report. As Chairman Eisenberg indicated, this is the 7th in a series of reports that I have prepared and submitted to both the State Water Resources Control Board and to your council. And here's the section in the Water Code which authorizes the Water Master to prepare these reports. This report's a little bit different than a lot of the reports I've prepared in the past, which mainly dealt with water right issues. This report is more relevant to water quality issues and to conveyance operations. And as you can see from the statute, that the reports are also supposed to deal with this topic. So before, and kind of by way of introduction to this topic, I want to talk a little bit about Delta hydrodynamics. And the gates and barriers are essentially a way that seek to modify these hydrodynamics in a beneficial way. And obviously the three major dynamics are the tides, and that's really still the dominant feature of how water gets moved around in the Delta. In the report, I took some time to explain, the tidal cycle, basically too high and too low tides each day, and the flows from the tides are orders of magnitude higher than flows either coming into the Delta or Delta outflow. But the other two hydrodynamic aspects are river flows into the Delta and exports from the Delta. And gates and barriers are basically, a way to try to deal with some of the hydrodynamics in a beneficial way. The present operations of the major water projects and pumping can impact two major issues: water quality and the issue of having fish in the water supply corridors and getting drawn to the export pumps. And so these barrier projects are a way to try to address both of these issues, try to improve water quality in certain places, and also to keep fish out of these fish corridors. It's kind of nibbling around the edges, but I think it can help, as you can see from the following slides. So what I'm going to talk about basically is some of the present structures in the Delta, the barriers and gates, how these gates could possibly be reoperated and improved to make them work better, and also talk a little bit about future projects. So when you talk about existing structures in the Delta, kind of going from the north to the south, you see I'm going to talk about three major projects in the North Delta, the Central Delta, and the South Delta. And I'll briefly discuss each one of these and how they address these issues of water quality improvements and keeping fish out of the export corridors. The slide here talks about a North Delta salinity project called the Suisun Marsh Gates. And basically what this project's all about is you have, because of kind of the geography and the way that the water is moved around in this area, there's a net natural movement of water from the west to the east, which obviously affects salinity and increases salinity in the Suisun Marsh. And the way the gates are operating is when flows are high, they close on the flood tides and open up on the ebb tide, and that pushes fresh water to the west. And this project has actually worked quite well. It has had water quality benefits and has been around for a long time. To address navigation concerns, going back to the picture, there are boat locks, and there's ways to get navigation through those gates. Okay, moving on to the central delta, the main barrier or gate project is the Delta cross-channel gates, and that's a picture of those gates. It's located a little bit south of Sacramento on the Sacramento River. And the main purpose of the Delta cross-channel gates is to provide a more efficient way to get water down to the export pumps. But an unintended consequence is that fish are drawn toward the export pumps when the gates are open. So closing the gates can keep fish out of these water supply corridors. And in fact, certain water board decisions require that the gates be closed during periods of fish migration to keep these fish in the main Sacramento River channel. Now you're talking about the South Delta. You've got what I call the South Delta Barriers projects. There's 3 or 4 projects are basically temporary projects where rocks are put across some of these sloughs and water courses in the South Delta. And their main purpose, and they're temporary and put in and out each year, is to increase water levels in the South Delta. Also, one of them is trying to affect fish movement. But they do have an ancillary purpose of improving water quality and circulation. If you vary the heights of these barriers in South Delta and open up the tidal flats in certain ways, you can try to improve circulation, because salinity in the Southern Delta has been a real vexing problem, and these projects at least have some ability to try to help that situation. Turning to reoperation or improvements to these existing facilities, there have been proposals put in place to try to enlarge the size of the Delta cross-channel gates and make them operable so they could be operated more nimbly, perhaps in conjunction with the tides, to try to both help salinity conditions and to help fish migration and keep the fish out of the corridors. Same thing with the South Delta temporary barriers. If there have been proposals to try to make those barriers operable, they would be more flexible and could be used perhaps to a greater degree in improving both water quality and beneficially affecting fish movement. The next topic I want to talk a little bit about is what is called non-physical barriers. There have been some pilot projects and studies trying to see if fish migration and movement can be affected without actually constructing a physical barrier, and there's a combination of light, sound, bubbles. I've heard anecdotes that the best sound major in some of the tests to try to keep fish out of these areas is bagpipe music, believe it or not. I don't know if that's an anecdote or not. There's predator concerns with some of these barrier projects, not only the non-physical but also the physical, and there's been certain mitigation attempts to try to keep these barriers from not acting as kind of a magnet of drawing fish to them, so that predators can have their way with the fish that are there. Regarding possible future projects, I've listed 4 here that are potential future projects. I'll talk about 2 of them. The first one is called the Frank's Tract project. And the Frank's Tract area, as you know, Frank Tract is one of the original islands in the Delta that was flooded and was not reclaimed.
Flooded in the 1930s.
30s, I believe, the 1930s, correct. And it has kind of a similar situation to the Suisun Marsh area, where you have kind of a net movement of water from the west to the east, drawing salinity in there, and also the fish can move through there pretty easily to get toward the export pumps. So kind of similarly to the Suisun Marsh project, you would have a series of gates and barriers to try to do 2 things, to try to improve water quality in that area and also keep the fish away from the export pumps. Now here's probably the most provocative slide in this whole presentation. entitled this slide, "The Western Tidal Gates." And the picture on the left of that slide is an existing structure that's in Holland, I believe.
Rotterdam.
Yes, and what happened is back in the 1950s there was some pretty dramatic floods that led to hundreds of lives being lost and billions of dollars in damage. And what was one of the mitigations for all that was the construction of this gate project, and it's an operable project that has existed since I think the 1960s or 70s. And there has been some studies of whether a similar type structure could be placed in the delta, and the portion on the right-hand side is a kind of a similar-looking project that would be constructed just below the confluence of the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers below Chips Island. Now, this whole idea of having a western barrier in the proposal, when I bring it up to people, people just kind of almost laugh at it and talk about it's kind of this pie in the sky thing. But I think they're talking.
This is Wilson's Reber Gate.
Yeah. I think they're talking about kind of older proposals that were studied where you would throw a rock barrier across there, and obviously they had major issues with navigation and fish migration. This operable gate idea that the previous slide showed, that gate would remain open in almost all times, and the whole purpose of the thing would be to be insurance against a catastrophic event, such as a major levee failure caused by flooding or earthquakes, a tidal surge, climate change, major flooding, and you would shut that in those catastrophic events, because otherwise you could, in a worst case scenario, you could have the delta flooding, the export projects, being, in a situation where they'd be pumping salt water, and the delta itself would be coming saltwater, and a gate like this, similar to the project in Holland, would remain open, most of the times. The one in Holland, I believe, has only been closed two or three times in several decades, and this project could be sitting there as a insurance policy, not only to protect the export system, but also to protect the delta itself. And I think it warrants some consideration. And like I say, I've mentioned it to people, and they usually kind of scoff at it. But I think they're really looking at some of the older projects, and not something like this.
When I was in the Netherlands in 2009 as part of a Aquaterra conference on deltas of the world, they took us to the Rotterdam gates, which are immense beyond belief. I mean, they're just. I can't even remember how tall they are, but at least 10 stories tall, and they stretch across the river. We were told that actually they fudged on the findings in 2007 so they could test the gates to do it. Because, of course, the problem is once you close them, the river water behind the gate starts to build up, and if I remember correctly, they can only be kept closed for 7 days to prevent ocean surges before the flooding starts behind, showing that no single solution solves all problems.
Yeah, I looked at that issue also, Chairman Eisenberg, and I think the thing in the delta with the prism, because of the bays that are downstream of this gate, I'm not sure you would have nearly as big a concern with that. But my understanding is these gates, even though they're immense in size, can be opened and closed in a matter just of a couple of hours. They basically flood water into the tubing, and it sinks to the bottom, and it's kind of like a flapper on the old pinball machines, the way they operate. So I just brought it in here as just an idea that I think can maybe have a more serious look than it's had recently. So as far as recommendations, as the report concludes that existing gates and barrier projects have had a useful purpose. They have improved water quality. They have protected fisheries. They kind of nibble around the edges. They can't make a dramatic impact on things, but can hopefully help. And I think they can help regardless of which type of conveyance project is implemented. And additional projects that I mentioned could help. There is issues with predation that you have to deal with. Again, I would recommend maybe taking a more serious look at this Western Tidal Gate idea. And I think when you're looking into the future, I think you're looking for projects that both have water quality and fish protection features to it and are located in areas where boating concerns can be minimized. So that's basically the report. If there's any questions on it, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Mr. Fiorini.
Craig, good report. Thank you.
Thank you.
As you're probably aware, the legislature directed us to consider and to foster movement towards building the Two Gates project. I think it was listed in the statute under the early actions recommendations. Phil and I were a subcommittee of two that held hearings 2 years ago regarding early actions, and there was quite a bit of controversy surrounding Two Gates. Department of Water Resources had reasons why they didn't feel it was worth pursuing. Recreational fishing and boating industries were opposed to it. Do you have an opinion on Two Gates, its usefulness, and whether or not it should be pursued?
Yeah, I looked at the Two Gates project, and you're right in some of the opposition that was created. My understanding that perhaps the thing that drove the nail on the head against it was the local opposition, but a lot of the boating groups really got exorcised about where it was located. So that's why, in my recommendation, I think we need to look for locations for these projects that hopefully won't draw that type of concern. The Two Gates project, as you know, did have a lot of flexibility, and I don't know if different sites could perhaps be looked at, because I saw some benefit to that in that you could put it in pretty quickly, test how it worked, and get it out pretty quickly. But I think that particular project foundered basically on the location that was chosen. So if there might be other areas in the Delta where you wouldn't have these local concerns over navigation, where you might be able to look at that. Again, the Frank's Track project looks a little bit more attractive, to me right now is a more of an earlier action project, because from what I've heard, there hasn't been as much of a concern, and it has really kind of the dual purpose aspect of it, reducing the amount of salinity getting into that area, and also deterring the fish from getting into the supply corridors.
One more item. You mentioned that the barriers have had benefits to fisheries. The rock barrier that was installed annually at the head of Old River for the purposes of the VAMP study it redirected the salmon, the outmigrating salmon, but there's a significant question about the impact of predation that the rock barrier may have created. Recent studies show that 92% of the outmigrating smolt and fry were being eaten by bass. So the predation warning that you highlight is not just a minor issue, at least in the case of the head of Old River and the San Joaquin River flows, is a significant issue. The state board has stated in the recent proceedings on the lower San Joaquin River water quality control objectives that predation is an issue, and staff asked us at a recent meeting to help them add rigor to whatever water quality objectives are developed to address the predation issue. Do you have any thoughts about how the state board, how the Stewardship Council could engage the appropriate agencies that do have authority over that to do a little bit more?
Sure. Just a little bit of background on the head of Old River barrier project. The Department of Water Resources every year gives us the plan of how they're going to operate the South Barriers projects. And they concluded this year, after consulting with a lot of people, including fishery agencies and I think the federal government, not to install that project this year for exactly the reason that you stated, that they had studies were showing that while that barrier worked, obviously, because it was a rock barrier and it kept the fish from getting into the interior of the South Delta, by taking this long route around the San Joaquin River to get to the migratory route, the predation was perhaps worse than having no barrier, especially given some of the salvage efforts that were taking place down near Tracy. So, yeah, it's a very complex issue that needs to be studied. I think some of the ways perhaps we could work with the Stewardship Council is, again, trying to find appropriate pilot studies, test locations where you could maybe see, are there areas where these barriers could be put in where it would not have this predation issue? Are there things that can be done? I was involved in a meeting just a few days ago. It sounds kind of interesting. Basically, adding electricity to the water it conjures up all kinds of bad images. It would be very low amounts of electricity, and it would deter or move predators, downward to a place where they could be, taken out of the water course and moved somewhere where they wouldn't have as bad an impact. And that's actually being studied right now. So there are a few things that can be done to try to address the predator thing, and I would be happy to work with whoever on your staff would be wanting to work on this and consider things like this project with the low voltage in the water is only one of many.
Good.
One last thing. Have you engaged the Fish and Game Commission about this issue and searched ways that they might be more aggressive in dealing with predation?
I have not personally.
I think that's the agency that has some degree of authority.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. Other questions? On this report, I just want to say congratulations. All of your reports have been good. This is the most understandable perspective on barriers and gates I've read, and it's, in spite of the use of 6 acronyms, is very close to understandable by anybody who spends a little time. And it's really helpful to see at one time in the discussion and also on their maps the major and significant barriers and gates that everybody tends to talk about in isolation. And it's I found this to be very, very useful as a document.
No, I appreciate it. It's a little bit out of my comfort zone because I was dealing more with technical versus legal
Right.
issues, but I think it was a timely report, and I appreciate the comment. So then I'll